The town of Coeur d'Alene was born on the edge of the fort. And so really, had it not been for Fort Sherman and General Sherman, there would probably have been no city of Coeur d'Alene. It really started with a battle that the United States government lost. And we're talking about the Battle of Little Bighorn. And that was in 1876. When that battle was lost, the Second Transcontinental Railroad was making its way in this direction. So the government was very concerned of all the settlement, the railroad coming through, that the Indian problem be solved, the conflict with the Indians that resulted in the defeat of Custer. And so they assigned probably one of the most famous generals in America at that time, General William Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, Civil War general. He was in charge of all the Western armies at that particular time. And the War Department asked Sherman himself to come out and make an inspection tour of this region to determine if there were other uprisings, where we have enough forts, do we need more facilities in terms of forts? And it just so happened that Sherman came out 1 year later after Little Bighorn in 1877. Well, what was happening just shortly south of us, 120 miles south of us, is the Nez Perce tribe. Certain bands of the Nez Perce tribe were refusing to go on the reservation, and there was beginning to be major conflict right there. And so when he was here, he decided, well, he would do two things. He would repair an old federal road that went from Fort Benton, Montana, right through here to Fort Walla Walla, and then he would build a fort about halfway between. And it just wound up that where the Spokane River runs out of this lake, that's the site that was chosen. Sherman's reaction to this area still stays with us, because he indicated in one of his journals that this area was America's little Switzerland. And so he was really impressed with the scenery. In many ways, that created problems later on, because where he eventually located the fort, it's no doubt a beautiful spot, right, where the Spokane River runs out of the Coeur d'Alene Lake. But in the spring, heavy runoff, it floods. And so he basically had a fort built on a floodplain. And it was not named Fort Sherman until the general retired in 1887, just as the town was being incorporated. The founding fathers they felt that Sherman was responsible for the fort, which was responsible for the town of Coeur d'Alene. And so they wanted to have the fort renamed. So in 1887, the federal government allowed that to happen. And so Coeur d'Alene became Fort Sherman. We're now inside the Fort Sherman Chapel, which is the second oldest church in this region. We're in one of the last remaining buildings of historic Fort Sherman. The first building, they started building basically the barracks in 1878. And there were 53 buildings, including an opera house, which we normally call the Post Hall. This one, it was incredible. When the fort was created, there were no towns around the area. And so basically it was an intact community with everything that you needed to survive. Sherman never lived here. He came back in 1883 when probably about 2/3 of the fort was completed. He came back for an inspection tour, and he may have sat in this very spot I'm sitting right now. He came into the chapel, and so he visited the fort, visited the area, and never came back again. By the time the fort was constructed and garrisoned, there were never any conflicts here. The only conflict, many of the commanders would say, the most conflict we have in this area is with the little town that's growing up, the saloons and brothels in the little town. But there was one thing that they did get involved in 1891. Once the mining had started and the unions began to develop and they tried to unionize mines, the mine workers, there was conflict. They were actually shooting at each other. Martial law was declared by the governor, and since the closest federal troops was right here, they got assigned to basically keep the peace and during that mining conflict. It had to do with what was going on in the entire West, the closing of this fort, because in 1891, Wounded Knee was the last official Indian war. even though there were skirmishes with the Geronimo and his group in the west. But the Indian War period was over, so there was a move by the federal government to close down all the temporary forts that had been built during that Indian Wars period, including Fort Sherman. Today, there are only 3 buildings left of the fort. The building which we're now in, which is the official chapel, it was built in 1880. It's now owned by the Museum of North Idaho, and we use it for a variety of functions. The other building that is left, which was built in 1878, 2 years before this building was built, and that was one of the officers' quarters where the single officers that were not married live, sort of like apartments for them. That building is still here, and it's still in use. We use it as faculty offices for North Idaho College. There is one more building, which is actually a brick building, which the only brick building on the fort was what we call the powder magazine, and that's where they stored the weapons and the powder. That building was also the very first building for North Idaho, Museum of North Idaho. And so really, had it not been for Fort Sherman and General Sherman, there would probably have been no city of Coeur d'Alene. That's one of the reasons why downtown Main Street is called Sherman Avenue.